Hello, everybody, and welcome to the August 17th, 2021 iteration of the Kubernetes SIG Windows community meeting. As always, these videos are recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so be sure to adhere to the CNCF Code of Conduct. Let's just get started. We can do some introductions if any folks want. I haven't been a lot of people, or like we haven't had a lot of use for this section of the meeting notes. So if in the future we don't, might consider dropping this and just seeing what happens going forward with that. But I don't see too many new folks on the call, so we can just go right into announcements. I don't have any other announcements for today. If anybody has any announcements, please raise your hand. We can get those started. But same announcements from last week hold. We're still kind of in the middle of KEP collection, and the KEP enhancement freeze is, I believe, the first or second week of September. I need to check the date again. So we'll continue working towards that. I don't see anything in the chat or anybody raising their hand. So James, do you want to talk about some of this perf work that you've been doing? I see you added a bunch of issues to the agenda.
Yeah, so we had a report a while back that when the metrics summary endpoint gets called, there's a context deadline exceeded. And this was reported a few different times. There's a couple different scenarios where this happens, but we thought we'd fix it with bumping up the priority of kubelet and kubeproxy and some other services like that. And it did seem to eliminate it for the most part, but we still got a report of it. And I was looking into it a little bit further and added some more metrics, and I was able to reproduce it. It doesn't happen. It's very hard to reproduce. But essentially what I found was that if there's multiple concurrent calls to the stats endpoint, one of those calls can kind of hang out and take a fairly long period of time to return. In most cases, it's only at over a minute to maybe 2 minutes, and some really long cases, it can be much longer than that. And so I started looking into this further, and the metric server has a 60-second timeout, and when the metric server calls and it takes over that minute, the metric server times out, and then when you do kubectl top nodes, you don't get those metrics back for that node for that time period. And this also happens if you're using HPAs. You'll also see this kind of manifest itself. The HPA can't query the metric server because the metric server doesn't have the metrics for those logs, and then your stuff doesn't scale. So I started looking into the code a little bit further, and that's when I opened up a few of those other issues. There happens to be in Docker shim, and this actually is the case for container D as well. We make two separate calls to HCS stats endpoints for the containers. I think we used to go through Docker, and then we went back and go directly to HCS. When that happened, we also collect metrics stats on a separate part of that call. And so we actually open up the containers twice and then call the stats on those twice, which adds quite a bit of CPU load to the system. When I removed that, I saw about a 40% increase in or 40% decrease in CPU. And so I went to go try to fix that, and I noticed that container D doesn't have network stats. And this is because the network stats for container D, so container D creates a container in the v2 HCS shim API. And when we query for metric stats for the network stats, we use the v1 API. And so you don't get any stats coming back for those containers. And so what I did was went back to HCS shim and exposed out the network stacks, and then plumb them in to PR that I have open Yeah, it's that work in progress one. I'm waiting on a release of HCS shim, which should come out this week. And then I was gonna we're gonna vendor in the new HCS shim, and then go ahead and I'll rebase this PR. One other thing I did here was when I was testing the metric stats, I ran a couple 4 to 5 concurrent calls to the metrics endpoint at the same time. And this can happen because the eviction component, we'll call it, the metrics endpoint, the metric server might call it. And then if you have any logging components, in our case, it was Azure Container Insights, also call it. You get 3 or 4 of these stacked up on top of each other. And what happens is within the Docker shim case, Docker shim opens up the named pipe for everyone. And so it causes a write to the file system, which causes a higher CPU during that time period. And it exponentially goes up as you make more calls to this stats endpoint, or there's other actual things happening on the system. So if there's other containers starting or stopping, and you make a call to this endpoint, it exponentially goes up. So the other thing I did was I refactored the metric endpoint to not make any Docker calls. We weren't collecting any extra information there that we didn't already have. And so, yeah, so that's kind of a summary of all the things. It was kind of a little rabbit hole as I went through it. But if everybody could take a look and give some feedback, it'd be useful. I don't know if other folks are also seeing this, but wanted to just bring it up here and share what's been going on.
Yeah, I'm also curious, is anybody else on the call seeing reports or experiencing themselves issues with metrics timing out on Windows nodes, or any of the different ways that can manifest? Most likely it's that HPA or horizontal pod autoscaling stops working. If so, I think we'd be very curious if any of or all of these help kind of alleviate those symptoms in your workloads.
I haven't seen it, but I haven't done a lot of extensive testing of HPA, to be honest. So it might be something that I might have a little bit of a play with, just to see what I spot.
Yeah, as James mentioned, like at least over in Azure, we were seeing this quite a bit. And then when we did start setting the process priorities for the kubelet, that did help. But we're still seeing this under kind of a lot of system pressure. Again.
One thing I'm not particularly sure about because I haven't seen it, but does Containerd even collect network stats in the first place?
Doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, because the call to collect stats for the HCS v2 API doesn't return stats at all. In v1 for HCS stats, it did. And so we have an internal bug to fix that. That's going to become important when we go to the cry-only stats. But in the meantime, by exposing these stats through HNS, we'll get those stats exposed until we're able to cut over, which is probably still a couple of releases away.
So yeah, I haven't noticed issues with timeouts, but yeah, one point to confirm is the network stats. So I noticed this with Containerd versus Docker, that the summary endpoint doesn't return any additional network stats. So it would be great, when we get this fixed. Thanks, James.
I'll also mention that I did see the CRI only stats was added to the SIG node agenda today to discuss some issues. I think on Linux they're having issues with some file system stats. I'll try and kind of mention this as well, that this will help, that moving to the CRI only stats will definitely, or should definitely help with Windows performance.
Probably a bit of an odd question, but do we have any tests around like metrics collection with metrics server that we could kind of run a suite on and then see if it's a flaky test or whether it's something else?
We have one very basic test that I believe I added a while ago when we've tried to fix this, when we tried to fix the stats timeouts hanging in like 117, 118 timeframe. And what that test does is it just creates a number of containers. I think it's like 10 containers in parallel, and then queries the metric endpoint a number of times and checks to see if the average duration of that call is below a certain threshold. We don't do anything super fancy about trying to, call it in parallel a bunch, or maybe covering some of these other containers.
I think it's
or
tagged
scenarios.
as serial, which is why we never use it, right? I think that one, we skip it internally in our CI jobs because it's serial.
Regarding stats collection, there is one use case that they are actually polled and used. For example, pod horizontal autoscaling, in which basically if the CPU usage goes over a threshold, the pods should increase in number or decrease accordingly. But those are not conformance, so I don't think all the jobs are running them.
And yeah, we marked that as serial because we were seeing when we were running it as part of the daily test pass, sometimes there wasn't enough space on one of our test nodes to schedule 10 containers in parallel. So we just marked, and so we were seeing test flakes with that timing out, waiting for all the containers to start. But we do exercise that regularly in our CI jobs under the serial slow test pass.
It's a good thought to maybe see if I can come up with some sort of test.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be
Yeah, I
quite
think
cool
there's-
to just. Oh, sorry.
Or go ahead.
I was going to say it'd be quite cool to just like at least know we're getting each. Like we could have a test that like says checks we're getting CPU for the pod, whether we're getting memory, whether we're getting disk usage, network, obviously when it's there, things like that. And then that way at least we can just see that a result is returned that's expected and not just 0 on them or something.
Yeah.
There is one test that does some like sanity checking. It just makes sure that there's a value there. And I added that for the log collection metrics that are there that I added in 120, I think. And so maybe we can extend that a little bit more extensively to like catch the network tests, make sure we don't drop those again.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, this sounds like you could put this in your conformance testing.
I just made an issue. I'm so excited. So I think it's just deserializing what we already have, but I'm not sure. If anybody wants to dig in, I feel like this might be a great getting started issue for the E2Es for Windows, right? I don't know. Like basically it would be like investigating our test coverage of metrics. I'll write it up so it's like a good first issue.
Yeah, and I think that'll be really important to kind of piggyback off of the CRI only metrics work that's happening and make sure that it works for Windows while that's all going.
I can help with that if needed. I did some time ago basically a metrics collection for current integration testing container D, including for Windows. So I can basically copy paste that code if needed. It's testing CPU and memory and so on.
Awesome, that would be great.
Yeah, so if you're gonna do it, I will not tag it as a good first issue because you won't need that level of introduction.
Let me link the issue that Jay just created here. All right. I guess it's some really good investigations and really good exploratory work here. Is there anything else to discuss? Otherwise, we can move on to a couple more of the agenda items. So let's do that. Next one is a test flake that we've been seeing occasionally, and during the last iteration of the backlog refinement, we decided to bring it up to the community meeting because we're seeing this kind of consistently. So I wanted to discuss this here. So there's an issue in the test job. Pods should delete a collection of pods on Windows. And there's a bunch of comments here that Claudio investigated this a lot. Is there anything you want to talk about here, Claudio?
Yes. Basically one idea. So looking through the issue, basically I noticed that that test in particular is spawning 3 pods and immediately deletes them, like in a matter of milliseconds apart. But in the way Kubernetes works, it goes through with the pod creation and including all the necessary steps, including image pooling and so on and so forth. So that got me thinking for a little bit. What if you actually spawn a pod and you just decide to delete it afterwards, and especially if it's a pod which would use a really huge image, you would still want to cancel that context and that request, though. You don't want it. You wouldn't want it to continue to pull a few gigabytes of data just to get deleted afterwards. But this is not currently how Kubernetes works. So I was wondering if we could change something like that in Kubernetes behavior to cancel requests. That would also fix the test as well, because you wouldn't have to wait for the pods to get deleted as well. Apparently, there has been quite a lot of flakes from what I saw in Kubernetes when it comes to racing events between creation and deletion of pods. So this might be something that they don't particularly want, but it might be useful for us at the very least, since we tend to have bigger images.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me tag SIGNode on here, and then we should also bring this up with SIGNode. I don't think that I don't really remember ever hearing discussions about that behavior before, so I don't know if there's good reason for not canceling that from the SIGNode folks, but I think that's the next place to do that. Is anybody else seeing issues kind of similar to this, or testing, or would have any use cases that would test this? Or does anybody see a reason why we would not want to cancel the context of starting the container in situations like this? I don't think I have any use cases where we would want this behavior. Okay, let me try and bring this up with SIGNode, and we can see where that conversation goes. Thank you for investigating this, Claudio.
Yeah, no problem. I can only tell from my experience, it happened a couple of times to wrongfully pull a wrong image when I wanted to spawn another container, and I had to wait for it to finish.
Yeah, sometimes 10+ minutes.
And there are also a couple of Windows images which have 10 gigabytes in size. So
Like IIS.
yeah, there's like almost full Windows version of a container image. For example, the image we use for the GPU testing, that's 10 gigabytes in size.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll try and get SIGNode involved in this discussion too. All right. I think I saw Aravind was adding a couple of things here.
Hey, Mark.
Notes to the agenda. Hello.
Yeah, this is about that projected volume issue that we discussed a few weeks ago. I do remember us wondering about adding some docs around this, and so I was, starting to write all this up, and I was also made aware about the bound service account token issue that this would cause for Windows pods, because I think this is now default in starting Q1 22, which means that
Yes.
if you are using a Windows pod, it's going to have a projected volume attached to it, which means the service account could have potentially an issue, which is what I'm trying to look into and write something up. So David Eads was telling me that we should add like a blurb or something in this section, or at least that's what I'm thinking we should do. Like add a note inside projected volumes stating how it's working today or not working today with Windows pods. And then also point it out here that there could be an issue with projected volumes for Windows. I'm just wanting to know what you folks think about it. Or is there a fix for this in the horizon? Then we don't need to do this. So I just wanted to bring this up again.
Yeah, I think you were out when we discussed this last week. We don't have a fix in the horizon or coming in the horizon, and we did kind of decide that the best thing to do would be to document this. Don't remember if we decided to document this in the Kubernetes.io docs only, or in some of the Microsoft like MSDN docs. Brendan, is this something that you could help Arvind with, is figuring out where we want to document this issue?
Yeah, I think we were considering a mix of both,
Yeah.
but definitely, yeah, that's something I'm happy to help with.
Okay, cool. I'm going to try writing something up first.
Sure.
I don't know where. I might write it up in like one of our OpenShift repos even and point you at it, and then we can figure out, okay, where do we put it in other places?
Yeah,
just
totally
as a
works.
starting point.
Yeah, and if you would like to help either contribute or author what goes on the
Yeah.
Microsoft Docs.
Yeah, I can do
page,
that too.
that would be
Is the Microsoft Docs also on like some GitHub thing that I can just open PRs for, or that's not how the Microsoft Docs work?
I believe that they are, and usually at the bottom of the page, there's a link to the GitHub page that's backed by.
Yeah. So what'll happen when you do them is you just hit the link and then just do it in the browser, like whatever changes you want to make, and then it'll go into review, and it'll happen pretty fast typically if they're watching it. So.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll write up a PR for like in maybe the WMCO OpenShift repo, just so that we have a place to say that this is the stuff that I want to add, and then I can work with Brandon to figure out, okay, this part goes into the Microsoft Docs, this part goes into the Kubernetes Docs, and I'm fine helping write up all that.
Awesome.
Well,
Yeah, let's talk on Slack.
I might be missing something, but wait. So does that mean that by default, internal service accounts on Windows pods don't work on 122 when this, or I'm assuming I'm missing something here. I just want to.
I wouldn't say that they don't work. I would say that
I mean, if that's the default,
it might be insecure.
Yeah, I think
so
that there
every
was
Windows pod in 1.22 has a security vulnerability. Okay.
Yep. So the thing is, I don't want to state it explicitly because I'm still trying to wrap my head around what the implications of having this projected volume to be, it's basically kind of can be accessed across pods, right?
Yeah.
And what does that actually imply? So that's why I'm suspecting yes, there is a security issue.
And this is, but it is mitigated by blocking volume mounting the host, right? So you have to be able to volume mount the host, which is, I think, in the security standard practices, it's blocked on the baseline. And
yeah,
so,
as one container user, if you add a host mount and then try and access and then know where to navigate to these projected volumes are on the host, I believe that container user can see the projected volumes from other container users. But if you block host mounts, you can't just like magically hop over to the other container's projected volumes. You need to search for it.
Yeah.
Is my understanding.
Yeah. The only thing we need to make sure is because of the way, because of the fact that we're not applying the correct permissions on a user basis for these files, is there something that we're missing here that even without mounting the host path, are we running into some trouble here?
And I think under the hood, it's a little bit more complicated than not applying the correct permissions. I believe that it's Windows container users share SIDs at the system level. So our security identifiers. So if you start multiple containers with as the same, well, even as different users, when you try and pop out of the container and access host resources, those all look like the same user to the containers. So, and that's where this is a little bit complicated and there's no easy fix, is that there is no, right now we don't have the mechanisms in Windows to say, if you're running in a container as this user, but you mount the host, that I want to be able to restrict access to these projected volumes that got remounted back in.
Yeah, I think that was the issue when I ran into when I tried to implement the fix, where I try to apply the permissions and like the message I think was, yeah, I don't know what this user is, because at the host level, it's not container user aware is what I understood.
Yep, that too.
Yeah,
they don't share the same user database.
What's that again, James?
They don't share. The container and the host don't share the same SAM database, or it's basically account management database. And so that's why, like when you try to apply permissions on the host has no idea about the users that are in the database that the container has.
I see.
So it just uses one SID or one security identifier.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, based on, that experiment that I remember doing with, James had suggested maybe it's not as big as an issue if we block host path mounting. But we should confirm that there's not some other loophole that we are missing here.
Yeah. Continue to missing inject completion. All right, folks. I need to hop over to SIG node now. Discussing KEPs and everything. So I'm gonna do that. I'll hand it over to Jay and James if you guys are all doing pairing today. Bye. And thank you everybody
See ya.
for
Bye, folks.
participating.
Yeah, I think we should do it today. Who all can stick around?